we start?
Let's.
It's nice to meet you.
You as well.
But in all honesty, as an NGO, we're really grateful to you for coming to the table here. Our client has really suffered. She's lost a lot. I don't think it's a surprise when I say there's a bit of mistrust as well, but the fact that we're here today, I think, shows a mutual recognition that we do care and value what has happened. We could easily go to a judge and just have them decide all of this for us, but I think the fact that we're here, from my end, I think shows that we have values that we agree on and that we're interested in getting the best deal for Sophia, but also for the government as well, and that working together is much better than just going to a judge under the RRA. So thank you for participating in this.
Sure. So I think we agree. I think as the government, our goal is to sort of bring some semblance of fairness for what has happened over the past few years, and to give fair restitution for the eviction, I guess.
Yeah.
We have a number of cases, so our issue is more limited based on how much money we have and how many clients that we're trying to serve.
Yeah.
So for now, we only have 17 million left to handle 375 claims. So if we manage to give every claim the equal number of money, then it will be 944 per person per month for the apartment we occupy.
Okay.
So that takes into a few assumptions. That's everyone getting the same amount, and that's everyone getting the same amount for a proposed equal amount of time. So that's not taking into account sort of location or any other factor.
Yeah, sure. And is this controlling or limiting your authority in any way? Or?
So it limits our authority in that we only have that much for all of these claims.
Okay. So that's in the back of your minds as we go through this.
So I guess a good question is, on leaving today, are you hoping to have a final number for a settlement that we could bring to a judge, or is this the sort of thing where, given the limited resources that you have, you would come up with a possible number and then need to go back and refine that further?
So there's two ways we can potentially go about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chance that we get increased funding over the next few months.
Mm-hmm.
So we can either come to an agreement today. We can come to a tentative agreement today, sort of depending on how those funds work, or we can push it to either a few months from now or to an arbiter.
But I guess that at any rate, I guess the option is, if we were to come to an agreement today based on the funds that you have, you were at the complete, that would be what we would take to the judge.
Correct.
Right?
So we have the power to make a deal today.
Sure.
And are there preferences that you have with regard to making your deal today versus making your deal in a couple of months from your standpoint?
We would rather make a deal today.
Us too.
Can you tell us why, from your perspective?
It is because this is also our first job here at the government, so our boss wants us to do a good job at this, and we also want to perform well. So if we can make a deal today, then also there are other 9 claims within the same building. So if we can make a deal today, we can go on to process other claims in the building too, so it'll be more efficient.
So from a time perspective, it's easier for us to make a deal today rather than sort of revisit the same deal repeatedly.
Yes.
And from our client's perspective, she's doing it tough, and we want to make sure that we're getting the compensation that she deserves sooner rather than later. So we share that.
And something we're trying to get a sense of for all our clients, but specifically yours, we don't have too much background data on her. Can you tell us a little bit about, we know she fled the country at one point and she's returning. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of her social situation now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's been really hard. Sophia had a good life in Capitala before she had to flee. So she was a music teacher. She was well respected in her community. She also has a son who's school aged, and since returning, she has come back to her apartment and found a lot of her furniture is missing. Heirlooms that were very special to her, that had been passed down from her family, disappeared during that time. She's come into her apartment to find that one of her rooms has had the windows bricked over and is not really serviceable as a room that it used to be. But like on top of that is she doesn't have a job. Like since you guys cut back education spending, not only is she adjusting to the fact that her house is just disturbed and not as it used to be, but also her life isn't as it used to be as well.
And we understand that you personally did not like cut back any of the
course.
funding, right? That the government is in strapped times with all
Yeah.
these claims.
And looking forward, what is her goal? Does she want to move back into the same house she's been in? Does she want to? We know that there's over the last few years there's been sort of a difference in how different sections of Capitale are doing. Does she want to relocate? What are her plans or going forward over the next few years?
Well, I think she loved her home. She still does. She likes where she lives. She wants her son to grow up in that house, and so she's really looking for compensation to recognize and replace what she has lost, rather than have even more displacement and start somewhere else and feel even more disconnected from the country that she has just become like reacquainted with.
I think also to your point about the changing demographics of the city. So, as you probably know, the apartment is sort of right on the border of North Capitale and South Capitale, really just a stone's throw across the river, and is immediately proximate to the university. So, in many ways, although the fortunes of those different parts of the city have changed globally, where she has been relatively stable by virtue of the sort of steady stream of students who have sort of relatively stable needs and represent a normal market share there. So,
Do you have any plans for the South Capitale region?
So that is unfortunately not part of our jurisdiction. So
No.
I imagine there's going to be a revitalization campaign that happens, but we don't know much about it.
Yeah, sure.
The reason why we brought this up is because if Sophia is determined to move to North Capitale, where the economy will be better, the pollution will be less, we are willing to offer $10,000 for her relocating fee besides the compensation.
thanks for sharing that. We'll take that
Yeah,
under advisement.
a lot of the communications we've had with her are about reestablishing her home. So I'm not sure where that will factor in quite yet, but we'll see how it plays out.
So it sounds like, if we're hearing you right, major values for you are potentially limiting costs because you have a high number of cases to get through, timeliness of getting this settled, just because, again, of the volume of cases that you're dealing with. Are there other interests at play that I've missed that are important for you?
No, I think those two things probably sum it up, at least from our perspective. It sounds like from your perspective, your goals for your client are to, one, sort of have her go back to the same location that she's been in, so either remodel or something for her house that she left, so not necessarily relocating. And then in terms of time, to get this done as timely as possible.
Yeah, I think to add, Senator made reference to this, but right now our client is without employment that she previously had, and so the financial part is critically important to us, and that finding a fair solution for her that honors both the sort of lost income and then the changes in what was in the home in addition is quite important.
Yeah, it's less about being back in that apartment at all costs, but more about recognizing how far back she has been set as a result of this, and how displaced she feels in that house right now.
Sure.
Yeah, so So we have two benefits offered to Sophia personally.
Okay.
So one is we can get her a job as an elementary school teacher, and the second is we can send her son to school if her son is not enrolling to a school yet.
And is that conditional upon anything, or is that just a benefit that you can offer us as part of this discussion period?
This is the benefits we can offer
Mhm.
to you guys because, so this is condition to Sophia will have a living from now on. So because she will receive salary from the school.
Mhm.
So about the compensation about the total compensation, will she willing to take a little less than what she expects right now?
We'll definitely keep that in mind. It sounds like we're about ready to move on to talking about the compensation then, and thank you for talking about other ways that she can feel welcomed back into the community and have some security. That's really good to hear. So the way that we saw the Repatriation and Repossession Act playing out was that there's really two categories. So the first is calculating the fair market value of the rent while she had fled. And then there's a second category as well, which is compensation for any damage, that's greater than wear and tear. Do you have a preference about which one you'd like to discuss first? Whether you want to talk about quantifying the compensation for the damage, or whether we want to talk about fair market value first?
Why don't we talk about fair market value first?
Sure.
Because I think from our end we just have more data
Go
for
ahead.
that.
Mhm.
So it looks like in that area there've been houses sold previously in sort of different square footage rates, but something in her area at the time she initially fled was probably around like sort of the $1,200 a month range. If you take into account depreciation over the last 4 years, that tends to drop a little bit. So houses sort of neighboring hers right now have sold or have been, the restitution costs have been around $800 to $1,000 per month for a 4-year span.
So the way you arrived at this number of 1,200, the way you've arrived at the restitution is clear, right? That's the settlements, is what you're speaking of. The 1,200 number, how did you arrive at that number?
So that was a number that was for a similar sized apartment that was in a similar neighborhood as hers, that was left unattended to for the same amount of time.
And what is the square footage that you have? What was the square footage of that apartment?
That was, I believe, 75.
And do you happen to have this map? If you don't, 72, so somewhat smaller.
I see it.
Yeah. And then the location of that apartment, do you have a sense of where it was on the map?
We're talking about this.
Yeah.
Okay, but here,
Just let me make sure I understand what you're working from.
apartment B.
Apartment B. So behind the college here a bit, down in this area. So a little further from the river. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and a little bit further into South Capitola. All right. And any other data? You had mentioned that you had a decent amount of data. So you have the data on what restitution has been. You have the data on what that particular apartment rented for 6 years ago. And in the interim, South Capitola in particular has depreciated. Any other sort of criteria or data that you had used to arrive at those numbers, or that you guys are aware of, that the courts have been using for this?
Have we talked about the house selling?
No, you can.
Okay, so according to one of the officer at the cafeteria, about South Cafeteria business permits and licensing office, he informed us that one of the apartment in Sophia's building recently sold for $20,000 less than the buyer had paid 10 years ago. So there's a deflation of the housing price
Mhm.
with for the Sophia's
Mhm.
building apartment.
Do you know what the specifics about that apartment were?
We don't have the specifics, but we also have similar data about house selling. So, yeah. So at year one, when the war began, it was 380 $380,000, and at year six, it will be 353,000,
Hmm.
and it's for 80 square meter apartment.
And that's what it actually sold for, not what it's valued at?
What's the question?
So that's what it actually sold for, not what it's valued at. I'm just trying to reconcile some differences between the data that we have and the data that you have.
Yes. So it is the sales and rent. It is from the sales and rental data from the company that provided us for the past 6
I
years.
see.
Yes.
Okay. Because I will say that those estimates are actually quite a bit lower than those that we have from the tax assessors. So the monthly rent for an apartment about the size of Sophia's we have is about $1,400 in South Capitol and then $1,600 in North Capitol, and we could argue about exactly where hers falls, but I think it's probably fair to say that it falls somewhere between something in the heart of South Capitol and North Capitol. And then in fact, as you know, in North Capitol, those actually numbers have increased in value over the last 5 years, and so I think there's a conversation there to be had about whether we think her apartment might have appreciated in value or not, which is also why I asked about the other building in the other apartments in that building, because it sounds like based on what we've learned from realtors is that there's quite a range of sort of views, right? There are places, there's a penthouse with a beautiful view of the entire city. There's Sophia's, which had a river view that was unobstructed before the window was bricked over. And then there's some shabbier apartments that are lower down. And so there's a huge range, it seems, of possible value there. And so understanding that might be what Sophia is expecting to get something closer to those values that we have had and we've reviewed with her.
We want to confirm that Sophia's apartment has the river view, right?
Mhm.
This is not listed.
So currently that window, I believe, is the one that is bricked over, but it has a river. It has an
Yeah.
unobstructed river view,
Mhm.
and had a couple of and lost a lot of the furniture. But before she came in, was sort of considered an architecturally quite lovely building, and her apartment in particular also was valued quite highly. So I think that is by way of saying, I guess you had mentioned sort of monthly rent. Where does that put you in terms of what you'd be willing to offer in total for the 5 years that Sophia was displaced?
You're talking about the rent per month.
No, I'm talking about the total settlement that you would that based on your calculations. So you've got $1,200 a month as the rental for something similar, and then we haven't gotten to damages, but I guess $1,200 a month times 12 months. I don't have a calculator on me. Would be like what, 14,000, and then for 5 years.
4 years, right? Exactly.
She was
Exactly 4 years.
Oh,
That's how long the government has occupied the apartment.
Yes, you're right. 4 years. Apologies.
got it. Yeah, sorry. So 14,000 times 4 would be, can I do math? $56,000.
Thank you.
We'll calculate it out. We could put everything in monthly, but we can certainly calculate out in total preparations.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be $57,600.
Yeah. I think if we're being honest, that's quite a bit lower than we had hoped for Sophia, particularly given the wear and tear on the apartment, although I know that's a simple part of the negotiation that we talked about. I think, I mentioned $1,400. Another apartment is rented for $1,600 in that same building for the last 6 years. So is there any flexibility there for you in the monthly rate that you would be willing to reimburse?
What range were you hoping for?
We were hoping for closer to about $100,000 for the apartment alone, based on some of the appreciation for North Capitala, the fact that she's so proximate to that, and then like we said, some of the data that we had suggests that the rental for similar apartments in her building was about $1,600 a month, and well, that's not a huge difference for a month. Certainly, it appreciates over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would come out to be roughly 2,800 or so a month. Is that what the calculations you got?
Yeah. So if you look at some of the I'm sorry, $90,000 for the apartment, and then we were talking about damages.
Sorry,
My
yeah.
apology. Yeah. So 90,000. If you run that through, what is their monthly?
I think that's around.
I think it's probably around 2,000.
That's
Yeah.
1870.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're looking again at North Capitala rates, let's say for an apartment that's like about the same size as hers, those ranged in the 4 years during which the government occupied from 1,720 to 2,200 now, and then in South Capitala for the same from at the very bottom something still above 1,200 in the 13,000 range up to 1,500. So if we split the difference between those, it seems reasonable for us to end up in the sort of upper end of the 1,000. So at least I think 1,500 a month. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I mean, with the tax assessors data that we have, that figure, which was the 57,000 roughly, represents probably the lowest rent. We don't even have rent that's scoring that lowly on the tax assessments. And depending on, like, we can talk about which criteria we think are
Most
better.
fair. Yeah.
But we think the rent that people are actually paying rather than valuations or lump sum settlements is probably a good way to set that
Sure.
fair mark.
And sorry, walk me through the number that you used to get to the 1,500.
So I have a super marked up version of it. Here, maybe I'll borrow yours because it's less marked up. So if you look at 80 square meters is a touch larger, right, than hers is assessed at. So if we look at yours 4, so the nadir is around 1,200, which is where you guys sort of put the docket at, but is most years 1,300 to 1,500 in South Capitala, and then if we consider the fact that hers is probably a little closer to North Capitala rates, particularly because she's Waterview, and we know that another apartment rented for 1,600 in her same building with an obstructed view of the river for the last 6 years. Then we look at the North Capitala rates.
And talk to me a little about that apartment, the 60.
So that apartment, what floor is that on? So it was on the second floor, so slightly lower, in the building adjacent to her building, that's slightly smaller, so 72 square meter on the second floor, rented for an average of $1,600 a month for the last 6 years, and it has an obstructed view of the river.
So we have there's one other piece of data I think it's probably maybe potentially more relevant for her. So there's a smaller apartment in her building, so 65 square foot apartment on the 5th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows, completely renovated 8 years ago, which hers was not. Panoramic view of the river, and that's only going for $1,400.
Okay.
So $1,500 seems a little high, just given this apartment is that's better than hers. It's going for.
All right, so we've got a lot of data out here on what the rental is. I think
a lot of criteria, none of which seem to align.
Right, and that's just what it's been renting for.
So that is what it's been renting for the past 6 years.
Okay. Maybe it makes sense to we've got some things simmering there. Maybe it makes sense to sort of pivot a little bit to the question of like what she can reasonably expect under the RAA for damages above and beyond wear and tear, which I think we can agree have happened for her apartment. What were your guys' thoughts on reimbursement?
But I've recorded like the gap between like 58,000 and 90,000. We'll return to that for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So according to the soldiers who have occupied Sophia's apartment, the apartment was in fairly poor shape when the soldiers moved in, and also the military had paid a moderate amount of money to prepare soldiers to move in. So the things they did is, one, they fixed the kitchen, I don't know how
Faucet.
faucets.
Mhm.
They fixed the kitchen faucet and they replaced old furniture, and also they made weatherproof doors and windows, which it did not exist
I
before.
think this is such a shame because, you know, the old furniture that we're talking about here are antiques.
Right.
And some of them had sentimental value, but some of them were valuable in themselves as antiques. So I think the soldiers' uninformed judgment based on an apartment they're like possessing unfairly, that's pretty tough for us to hear. From Sophia's perspective, they would.
It was a real loss.
Yeah, we totally understand that.
Yeah. Sorry, you were saying? Did
Sorry.
you? No, that's fine. Did you have something else to say? You said they felt it was in poor condition and they did some repairs in the kitchen.
Yes, and they
Weatherproofing.
had the weatherproof doors and windows.
Mhm.
Yes, and they replaced old furniture, which is bad effect on your side.
Right.
Yes.
I do think I appreciate that some of those represent possible value added. The weatherproofing, the bricking over of the windows certainly is a depreciation of value, and I think it's also worth considering that what they needed from the apartment is quite different from what she needed before then and what she needs now, right? So I'm not sure it's fair for Sophia to absorb the costs of what the army needed to do to possess her apartment.
Which, from what the surveyors tell us, was probably used as an interrogation room with all the weatherproofing, soundproofing, and bricking over, which is really not conducive to being a home.
So I just think, like, in appreciating that you're sharing what the data is that you have, but also thinking about the perspective that it puts us in now as a group of 4 people that want to move forward, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're all trying to repair a lot of, like, emotional damage and political trauma for this entire group. I think it's important for us to be forward-looking. And so we totally agree. I mean, there is a certain necessity of, like, assessing things that are damages past, but I think it's a little bit hard to sort of have a conversation about sunk cost by the military in this
Sure.
setting. So with all that said, given that, what were your sort of thoughts on what Sophia deserved in terms of reparations for damages to the apartment?
Okay, so because we don't have details about how Sophia think about
I can provide some of that for you,
the damage right now.
Mhm.
So I would like to hear what do you think your
Mhm.
expected damage cost would be?
So what Sophia has done, she's worked, she wants to restore what she had, so she's worked really hard in conjunction with a local antique furniture store, but the prices that he's giving back to her, even with a discount, still range around the $6,000 mark just to replace some of the furniture.
$6,000.
$6,000. And there are other items, for example, she had a family heirloom trunk, which has gone missing, which just is irreplaceable at this point, unless the soldiers can resurface it or there's something in your museum vaults that, seems similar. We've kind of just chalked that up to, a really tremendous sentimental loss, but we don't even have a value on that trunk.
And then the bricking over the windows, Sophia looked into when she came in terms of getting that removed, and it was about $15,000 to have the bricking removed. And as you can imagine, that's beyond her reach right now
Sure.
financially. So those are the numbers that sort of we're working with in terms of changes to the apartment that have made it less livable for her now than it was when she left.
So that's $21,000 in total.
21 because of the 15 and the 6.
Yep.
Is that
Yeah.
what you're getting at?
Yeah, so refurnish it and make it sort of reusable for the.
So I think in terms of options on that front, so the military is willing to remove the soundproofing,
Great.
which can, I think, take up a
Mhm.
sizable amount of that cost. So the options would be for her is that we can do it for her, or we can potentially give her more money to relocate, whichever one she will, or that
And that's
money
the
can be
$10,000
that would be the
figure.
$10,000. So we're willing to eat that cost.
Mhm.
I think in terms of sort of the furniture amount, it's tough because we don't have an appraisal of how how much of the furniture we have. We only have sort of what was documented when the military
Right.
came in, which said that the furniture was potentially falling apart from your end, antiques, and which makes it a little difficult to exactly gauge value. I think the military did put in some cost into improving the apartment from where it was, whether the weatherproofing the windows and doors. I think that's something she would have had to have paid for at this point, regardless.
Okay.
So I think probably around, I don't know what numbers you were thinking about, but maybe around, we can probably do half of that, 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
So 3,000 for the furniture, and then
We'll take
revision
care
of the window to open it up again.
okay, so in kind,
Mhm.
or 10,000 to move.
Mhm.
Yes.
And then it sounds to me, just to reiterate some of the things that we've discussed being on the table, other things on the table for Sophia as sort of reparations are a job in an elementary school as a music teacher
Mhm.
and a education for her son. Is that right?
Yes.
Is there anything that I missed that you guys brought up?
I think those were the two big things.
Because for us, we know how Sophia really needs a job,
Yeah.
more than anything, and how concerned she is about her son. So I'm sure we would be able
Yeah.
to factor this in, but then we've got to go back to this appraisal.
Yeah, I wonder if now might be a good time for us to actually maybe take a break and we can caucus a little bit and then come back together. Now that we sort of have all the data on the table, does that sound
Sure.
fair?
Sure.
Sounds
All
great.
right.
I will just go over here for a moment and pause that.